What's going on, family? Hey, so I got a special treat for you today. So 2 weeks ago, I had a live stream with Paul from Understanding Conspiracy, and we broke down Gunnar Heinsohn's theory that 700 years was added to the first millennium AD. Now, obviously, for people in the short season camp, we've got some receipts now. We've always questioned the timeline, but now we actually have physical scientific evidence, and Gunnar provides that. Gunnar was a professor, an economist, a sociologist. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us, but he did leave us with a lot of work, specifically his lecture from 2016, where he breaks it all down based on the stratigraphy, the science. So what I've decided to do, I broke down our nearly 4-hour live into 3 different parts. I edited it down for time and for content, and I added a few things in because I made references to other work by Gunnar. But I'm going to leave the link in the description for the original live stream on Paul's channel, and also Paul's edit of Gunnar's original presentation from 2016. Oh, and before we start the presentation, if you guys like this content, please hit the subscribe button. And if you're listening on the audio-only podcast, please give me a 5-star review. I really appreciate it. With that out of the way, once again, this is part 1 of 3 of Paul from Understanding Conspiracy, JT, and Gunnar's breakdown of the first millennium AD. Enjoy, guys.
Hello everyone, how are you all doing? Come on in, sit on down. I've got a special show for you guys today. I have with me Joe from JT Follows JC. Joe, how you doing? Can you hear me?
I'm doing excellent. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, we've had a bit of a late starter today. We've been sorting out some last minute technical things to make sure this stream goes as smooth as possible. We wouldn't normally do something like this live, something so technical, would we, for this reason? But I feel like
why not?
I feel like we just need to get this done because for those who don't know, we've kind of come across a presentation which has kind of just blown our minds. Is probably the safe way of putting this, because it kind of has confirmed a lot to do with the research that we've been doing into the little season, the millennial reign of Christ, and our prolonged efforts to try and find as much proof as we can to back up this contentious theory. Now, Gunnar Heinsohn, the guy who made this presentation, unfortunately passed away quite recently, I believe. Was it just last year?
2023.
Yeah, he died at the age of 79. And he made this presentation in 2016. Now, he's quite well renowned in his own little way. He was an economist, a sociologist, and kind of dabbled in chronology as well, and was kind of a professor of sorts who kind of just like to get his tendrils out into all sorts of topics. And he did this really long presentation about the first millennium and how there seems to be 700 years added to the timeline. And he just presents this amazing thing for like an hour, 14 minutes, and it's just been doing the rounds everywhere. So after Joe shared it to me and I watched it, I was like, we have to talk about this. We just got to do something with this. So I've gone through the presentation. I've added segments to it. I've kind of broke it up because there's a lot of information to take in at once into bite-sized chunks. And I've added some supplementary images to back up the things he's saying so you can visualize what he's talking about. And what we're going to do today, we're going to go through it segment by segment with you guys and with Joe and myself. And we're just going to comment on what we notice and how it corroborates with our own research. And maybe go through some of the things he says as well, which we may not agree with. And I think it should be a fun conversation. So, Joe, are you ready for this, Joe? Anything you want to add before we start?
No, yeah, let's just get right into it. I just think that this, to me, it's like an amazing. I actually was a Jason Jack who said we're just scratching the surface, and I was like, oh, I don't know. I was like, maybe we are. And then it's like this just gets dropped in our lap. Like somebody just sends this to me on Twitter, and I'm like, oh my, this is like. These are the receipts we need to kind of start to no, I mean, I don't know if we can ever prove this, but this has given us quite a bit of evidence that we're on the right track.
Absolutely. I mean, I think is it Velikovsky? I think he's kind of working off the back of somebody else who kind of did this alternate chronology thing. It's kind of along the lines of Fomenko as well, this type of revisionism of past events as not being layered on top of each other, as we're going to repeatedly hear about today, but actually being side by side in a short time span, basically. And again, we can never fully prove these things, but I think what we're going to see today is very compelling evidence. It's very compelling, and it definitely
it's scientific. It's scientific evidence,
Absolutely.
Which is like normally that we're not on the side of the quote unquote science, but it's like if this is where the science leads us, it's like that is, yeah, I feel pretty strong about it. I mean, I feel good. I feel really good about it.
And just to preface, for people who don't know who might be stumbling onto this video, we are a Christian truther channel. We're a conspiracy channel, but we keep it from the Christian perspective. The reason we're looking at this is because we're trying to find any supporting evidence for the theory that revelation and tribulation has already come to pass. The 1,000-year reign of Christ has already happened, and there's evidence for that, and we're living in a particular time in Revelation. Gunnar doesn't know, it's not a Christian and does not perceive it from this angle at all. So his work was not created to further this research, but we are going to use it to our own benefit, technically. That's what we're doing here, just as a preface. So Gunnar does say some things which are quite contrary to Christian belief here and there, and he's not a Christian. So that preface does have to be made for my audience who are Christians. Be prepared for this, and also for those who are coming to just listen to Gunnar. You can go and just listen to the whole presentation on my channel without any interference from me or Joe if you just want the information without our opinion. This is going to be an opinion piece today more than anything. So that being said, shall we just get straight into it and watch the first segment?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, so
and I will go back 20 years when I wrote this book, The Creation of the Gods. I dealt with the impact of celestial events, of celestial powers on the religion of man. And I stopped this book with the catastrophe that divides the Bronze Age from the Iron Age. If you believe in a Greek Dark Age, you know that the Bronze Age comes to an end around 1100 BCE. If you don't believe in it, as I do not, it ends around 600 BCE. And if you are a nerd for stratigraphy, it may even end later, like 400, 350 BCE. Anyway, it will end before the first millennium AD, after Christ C, whatever you prefer to call it. And I have to say today that the major flaw of this book was ending in the first millennium BCE and not looking carefully enough at the first millennium AD. Of course, I was aware of the crises in the first millennium hitting the Roman Empire, but I belong to those who wrote about these crises as caused by demographical or by economical factors. This was the major flaw of thinking at that time, and I try to remedy this today. I worked on the problems of the first millennium AD since around 65 months, and we will look at the events that took place there right away. We start with a summary made by Wolf Liebeschütz. He survived the Holocaust in England. He was from Hamburg, Germany. And he had to say this: the climax of the classical city was reached in the first 2 decades of the 3rd century. After that, it never recovered. The empire was passing through the crisis of the 3rd century, first hit. Next one. During the 6th century, the cities of the Greek East were hit by a series of severe blows. The effect was like the crisis of the 3rd century. We continue from these 2 crises to another one that is much less known. But I just want to show you here what these 2 crises meant. First, you had this area attacked, and 300 years later you had this area attacked, and it looks as if there was very little overlap. And for such a big strike, you would expect, of course, some overlap at least here at these frontiers. Now to the 10th century collapse, Polish scholars were quite avant-gardist in that research. It shows us that we have massive destructions running all the way from Norway to modern Iraq. And I just quote here on the catastrophes of the Viking cities. In the Scandinavian lands, the old rural places of power, commonly called central places, all met their end. A general conversion to Christianity took place at this time. If we move to Poland, there was a rapid, sometimes catastrophic, collapse of many of the pre-existing tribal centers. These events were accompanied by the permanent or temporary depopulation of former areas of settlement. And we move further south to the Black Sea, to Bulgaria. The Bulgaria metropolis Pliska had its whole production area covered by considerable amounts of erosion material. The Pliska basin was turned into a desert landscape in the 11th century. So if we take a look again at the areas that were mostly affected, we have to go all the way around here, and you are getting curious how such a strange arch could have been so meticulously executed. We summarize three major conflagrations. First, 3rd century crisis. It strangles Western Europe, stretching some 2,500 kilometers from Lisbon to Bari. Then we have Justinian's 6th century comet, devastates Eastern Europe, stretching also some 2,500 kilometers as the crow flies from Sirmium to Karnak in Egypt. And then we have the 930s disaster. It flattens the slim periphery left alone by the first two strikes in a huge arch from Oslo to Baghdad, some 4,000 kilometers as the crow flies. So you get the impression that some cosmic monster had tried to wipe out this Roman culture with just one blow. And then in a way, the cosmic maze seemed to have slit a bit far to the left, to west, and the monster had to come back to do the job and hit the right side, and still was not happy because people on the northern edges and on the eastern edges appeared still to be standing and laughing, and the monster came back and finished the job for good. It's very difficult to imagine a celestial event of this type that so neatly divides the destruction into three periods. But it doesn't end here. If we look at the crisis of the 930s, 920s, 940s, give or take a decade, we have to acknowledge that the classical Maya culture also collapsed. And if we look at Samarra in Iraq, the Abbasid city destroyed around the 920s, 930s, we are looking at 12,500 kilometers as the crow flies. That's a huge distance, and it requires some massive agent to wreak havoc on these enormous areas. So what are the causes suggested for the first millennium cataclysms? For the first century crisis, the theory goes that enemies, barbarians, mostly Germanic tribes, destroyed the Western Roman civilization. Yet it's very difficult to imagine how human beings could make entire cities disappear under mud, sand, or water. The 6th century crisis is the most meticulously researched. Since 1984, theories are put forward. They are mostly focusing on volcanoes, Volcano Rabaul, Volcano Krakatoa, Volcano Tierra Blanca, and some unknown, unidentified volcano in North America. Since 2009, comets are taken into account, and in 2016, even former Comet Encke that disintegrated into the Taurets is seen as a possible impactor. For the 930s collapse, we have a major problem. It's the closest to us, and there are not any written resources for the sources for the earlier catastrophes. We have written sources, none for the 10th century, and the only agent so far considered is volcano Elgia on Iceland. Volcanoes Katla and Vatnajökull also exploded. 18 million cubic kilometers of lava were released, and 450 million cubic kilometers of sulfurous aerosols covered the northern hemisphere. This was big. If it was big enough to touch all the way down to Iraq and far west to the Yucatan, I cannot imagine. I think it must have been a byproduct of something bigger. Now, if you start doubting that we are dealing with 3 different strikes with very little overlap, if you believe it may have been just a single strike, of course, you are confronted with chronology. The strikes are divided over 700 years, and to imagine the 3 strikes as just one will force you to cut 700 years out of the first millennium. This sounds bizarre. It sounds just impossible.
Let's review that. 3 huge cataclysms separated over a 700-year period. So we have the first century crisis, the invasion of the barbarians, a mass movement of people from all surrounding nations of Europe just suddenly destroying and roaming through the land and taking over everything and killing a lot of people. Then in the 6th century, he's talking about, so this is 536 AD, this is the worst year on record we're talking about here. Volcanoes, everything that could go wrong, possibly going wrong. Mass famines, pestilence, disease everywhere, a mini ice age of sorts, the sun going dark for like months on end, just causing absolute destruction and disaster, and including even a comet is talking about there as well at one point. Basically, everyone's theorized that in that time, everything that could have gone wrong for humanity all went wrong at once. And then he's talking about a 10th century disaster, which is kind of like something that basically just utterly decimated everything. And we're talking about not only in Europe, as far as Maya, up to the Yucatan, and we're going far into China here as well. Same problem, famines, destruction, and Iraq is just destroyed and turned to desert, as he's talking about. Everything just suddenly disappears. But what he's trying to say is there's no overlap of these events when you actually look at them. So he showed, for example, the invasions of the barbarians. He says in the 1st century they invaded the west side of Europe, and then 300 years later they decided to invade the east side of Europe with no crossover in that boundary in the middle, which does obviously makes no sense whatsoever. The only way that's possible, and what he's trying to theorize here, is these are all the same event, all happening at the exact same time, and for some reason we've just added 700 years into the mix. So what do you think of all that? That's my quick summary of what happened there, what you just said.
I mean, I guess the first time I heard this video, I guess I was really surprised that like how these different events are the history on them is so unclear. And I think that's sort of what I mean, because obviously I've only really concentrated on a certain part of it, because when we did our video about 536, we're looking into it, and I remember thinking, like, this is really not all that concrete on what they're saying. Like in the theories about volcanoes, it's kind of like, well, I was like, in my brain, I was trying to think, like, there's historians who are supposedly writing things down, but like the details about 536 were just 1 or 2 lines about like, oh, well, we didn't have shadows in the daytime and stuff like that. And I thought that's a little bit weird. And then so they have to theorize that it's volcanoes that did it. And then later people say, well, it could have been comets. It's like, well, it could have been Godzilla. I mean, as far as like all the stuff you guys are saying, it's like, this is never, like, you're not really giving us any facts. You're saying, oh, well, we checked ice samples and tree rings and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, that's still not like history as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, interesting. When I first started to see that stuff, and especially when he's talking about like barbarians and people, that doesn't really explain how cities are leveled. And I know Vitali brought that up at one point too, saying, yeah, do you understand how wrecked Rome was? Like, so what kind of weapons did the barbarians have that literally destroyed cities? And like, and we know based on kind of history, people who invade cities would conquer them and use them.
Hmm.
They really have no, like, why would you, if you could conquer a city like Rome and you could rule over it, you'd rather do that, I'm sure, than
Hmm.
to destroy an awesome place, right?
Well, he
And
mentions, Pliska, this Roman city in Poland, was literally just turned to dust, gone, like eradicated off the map. What could possibly cause a flourishing, like, brick building city, like with basilicas all over the place and everything you can imagine, and imagine a bustling Roman city to just disappear into dust with literally a few ruins that remain? And we'll get into that later in the presentation. He kind of briefly mentions it here, but he does go a bit further into that later. It boggles the mind. He describes it as like, it looks like a cosmic monster has like give like Europe a whip 3 times, separated by many, like just like, oh, it didn't quite finish them off that time, let's go back in again after they just have barely had a chance to rebuild, and let's just smash them down a bit more. And it's pretty much just annihilated everything. Like, and obviously he's talking about God here, like as a cosmic monster. From his perspective, it does seem a bit odd and cruel, doesn't it? But if this is from a Christian perspective, let's get back to the millennial kingdom theorizing here, because that's what it's really all about. We can review what he says to the end of the world, but he's basically explaining tribulation here. This is...
Yeah, well, I mean, he's talking about wars, famines, like literally the heavens shaking and basically hell on earth. It sounds like the book of Revelation. What I find interesting, though, is the 10th century collapse, or the late millennial collapse. I mean, I thought it was interesting, and I'm not sure if he mentioned in this segment, I've watched this video a few times, that he mentions that's the one that has the least amount of details about, which obviously would be the opposite, right? Like that you would have better records of the last one, not the first one. And I do think that's interesting, because it's almost like, the overlap is there, and it's like that's why there's no details, because it's all the same event.
Right. Shall we go to the next one? See what else they have to say.
Yeah.
So when I started to understand the chronology of the first millennium, what struck me most is that from antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, to late antiquity, 4th to 6th century, and then to the early Middle Ages, 8th to 10th century, you always have the same architecture, the same Roman basilica architecture. There is no evolution whatsoever in the arts, in the sciences, in the architecture, as I said, and moreover, in the language too. Latin of the 2nd century is indistinguishable from Latin of the 9th century. So it's very strange, because before antiquity and after the early Middle Ages, you have evolution, you have changes. Within the periods, you have evolution. But between the periods, you have a standstill of cultural evolution that just appears to be absolutely impossible. So what to do? You ask yourself, is there any side in Europe or in the Near East, is there any side where you have traces of these 3 steps of civilization? Antiquity, late antiquity, early antiquity. If you have them anywhere superimposed on top of each other, you have a stratum for antiquity, one from late antiquity, and one for the early Middle Ages, superimposed on each other. So when you have the 10th century, you dig down and you find the 5th century or 6th century, and you dig down and you find the 2nd and 3rd century, always with this type of architecture. If you look for such a site, the selection is immense. So we know about 5,000 Roman towns and cities, 20 to 25,000 large agricultural estates, Villa Rustica. And further east, we know about at least 5,000 Chernyakov sites. They are outside of the empire. They are located about here. So we are looking at least 35,000 sites to find those that have these three periods, Antiquity, Late Antiquity, and the early Middle Ages superimposed on each other. And when I started looking, I thought there would be thousands. Then I thought there would be hundreds. And then I thought there would be maybe 50. Now I know there is not a single such site. And it's not a result I decided upon myself, but it is the result of asking many, many experts. So, if you get familiar with the idea that some 700 years have to be cut out of the first millennium because these three periods that form the 700 years are nowhere existent on top of each other, you ask yourself, why not obey scientific dating? And the most respected by archaeologists now is dendrochronology. You're counting tree rings. And so you have heard, of course, or read that the tree rings do confirm the number of years of the first millennium. This is true of a very famous man, like Mike Bailey. He says, of course, the first millennium has 1,000 years, not 1 year, maybe not 1 minute left. But then the Larsens, very meticulous researchers, they say no. For the first millennium, we just have 782 years in tree rings, not more. So we have to cut out some 218 years. And very recently, you have the attempt by Tim Cullen of Malaga Bay to say the first millennium has only 550 years. So you cut out 450. I have a lot of respect for all these researchers. I just want to show that there is no such thing as a certainty for the length of the first millennium, even in tree ring years. Moreover, in 2014, I have proposed finally to come up with a genuine blind test. So I had asked, especially had asked Mike Bailey, to start his work on a site in which you have Antiquity, 1st to 3rd century, Late Antiquity, 4th to 6th century, and Early Middle Ages, 8th to 10th century. And you take from every strata group, you take construction timber and construction timber from here and construction timber from here. And then you send it out to 5 different dendrochronological institutes, and they don't know, of course, what they're receiving, but somebody knows what he is sending out, and they will come up with a blind test. You would expect this has been done long ago. It was never done. I have to add, though, that my proposal was a bit mean, because I made the proposal when I had already discovered that there is no such site out of the more than 30,000 that we know that has these 3 strata on top of each other. Thus, you cannot find any place where you can pull out a piece of wood here, a piece of wood here, and a piece of wood here, and then date it.
So, there we go. Strata, layers, 35,000 known Roman sites, no layered strata anywhere depicting 3 different stepstones in civilization spread across 700 years. Doesn't exist. He ran his own blind test. Not one site is showing any layering of development or different types of architecture, and also the architecture is all the same throughout each of these time periods. There's no advancement in archaeology, in architectural style at all in these 3 periods. In fact, those in the 10th century are still building in 1st century style. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's incredibly sus if it's not how he says, and you don't take the 700 years out. It really makes no sense. I think I feel like I'm starting to understand what they meant by the Dark Ages. Oh, nothing really happened. Like they didn't build anything. They didn't do anything for these long periods of time. It's like obviously they did. But the real problem is like the Dark Ages is because yeah, they say it's dark because you have no real actual history
Mm-hmm.
because the history is wrong. And it makes sense. This is scientific, and it kind of makes sense to me in a way that biblically, what could bury cities? I got two good examples biblically. You could say the flood of Noah and then the book of Revelation.
What caused the catastrophe in the 10th century? That's my question.
I have only a speculation. I can tell you two things. One I already mentioned. It was Widukind of Corvey, the Saxon Germanic historian, who wrote in the 10th century and who told us that there were two comets, or a double-headed comet, it's not quite clear, in the time of the death of Henry the Fowler, the father of the first Germanic Roman emperor, Otto I. That's a written source. And so these comets have occupied me because they are never dealt with in the history of the 10th century. So they're mentioned somehow, they're not hidden. The source is there, the source is online, everybody can read it. But I connected this source with material that is found all over the world. It's found on the last Roman strata. If you date them 3rd century or 10th century, it doesn't make a difference. It's called black earth, dark soil, in German dunkler Moder, in Italian fango, which is mud. You have this fango, this mud, on the broom clean Forum of Rome. And I give another example. You have it in the territory of London, in two sides of the territory of London. One is called Londinium in Latin, and one is called Lundenwic. And in Londinium, the black earth that covers the Roman side is dated 230s after Christ. 1.5 kilometers to the west in Lundenwic, the same dark earth is dated 930s after Christ, 700 years apart. But the people of 930, they used the same streets that in Lundenwic, they used the same streets that the people of Londinium, 1,500 meters to the east, used 700 years earlier. These streets were absolutely impeccable for 700 years. Again, I propose to look at the stratigraphy of these two sites, just 1,500 meters apart, and then you have the dark earth falling at the same time around 930s. So that's one of the materials. The geologists have found what they call the younger alluvial fill. That's
I'm sorry, Dr. Heinsohn. Go to the first set of slides, Jacob, and I'll flip through them as he's speaking. Continue. Go ahead.
It's called the first alluvial fill, and you find it in valleys. And in the Earth's geology, we only know of two alluvial fills. The first one is dated around 10,000 BCE. I do not believe in that date, but I do not challenge it at this occasion. And that's the alluvial fill tied to the flood stories that we have in the Hebrew sources and in cuneiform sources, etc., etc. And then there is a second fill, and above many times in the same places, and it's a real extra separate stratum on the first fill. And the second fill makes difficulties of dating. In one place, it's always upon Roman material. In one place, it's in the 3rd century. In another place, it's in the 6th century. And again, in another place, it's in the 10th century. But the geologists that were occupied with it, they never found three such deluge-like catastrophes on top of each other, 3rd century, 6th century, 10th century. They're vertically in the same plane, and there's only one fill. But these geologists believe in Anno Domini chronology, so they have to do what they do. They say, we have this second alluvial fill, a deluge kind of fill. And it's running through the first millennium after Christ, third, 6th, 7th, and 10th century. And I say stratigraphically, it's all 10th century. So there's material that came down, right? And if you want to have a catastrophe that brings down material and does not repeat itself on a regular basis, you would like to have a comet crossing the orbit of the Earth, losing material, and by losing material, slightly changing its course that it cannot hit another time. So that would be my, not my explanation. I don't dare to call it an explanation. It's a brutal speculation. That's all it is.
I think it's unusual for cities to be completely buried under the ground. Like, what is it, like 15 meters worth of things buried under the ground?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what could do that? Like, and I'm not just talking about just like regionally or like very locally. I'm talking about like, you're talking about all of Europe
mm-hmm.
and things like that. I mean, I think that sounds like that's a cataclysm on the level that, yeah, it's Days of Noah, Book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the list, I think.
And the odd thing is, well, they're buried like to the point of you can't even see them anymore. Like, so, looking like 15 meters, some buildings like 20 meters high, and they're not damaged. They've been preserved underground in many cases. They're digging up these full like basilicas. They're still here, and it's, some of them obviously there's some damage, but they're in pretty good condition. Some of them aren't, some of them are. It's like it was a varied event of many very like degrees of damage was done. And it's kind of something like, I don't know, we know earthquakes, we know they can cause liquefaction of the ground, which means things can sink into the ground. That's one theory we have going. And mud flood is a thing that goes around quite a lot in these Tartarian alternate history circles. And people have said, oh, but the mud flood must have been, at the end of the 1,000-year reign when Satan was released or something like this. But we're hearing here, it's kind of like this happened quite a long time ago. Buildings were being buried. Like, it wasn't actually that recent.
Yeah.
Could we place the mud flood? And you theorize this. Could this actually have been maybe 1st century, 5th century, 10th century? If it was all one time, let's all put it back to just antiquity, 70 AD, sometime between 70 AD to 255 AD. Something happened which just buried everything. Just buried and removed cities off the map in one event like that. Who knows?
Yeah, no, it's incredible to the thoughts going through my head when I was first watching that, because I was of the belief that, okay, the mud flood happened in like the 1700s, and it coincided with the release of Satan. But at the same time, I was always a little hesitant because I was thinking, like, would God really give the devil that much destructive power to like just destroy everything on the earth? And I always thought that's kind of seems like it would be only God could do something on the level of the mud flood, because there's evidence of it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's interesting is Gunnar, and maybe just because he's got a different type of mind than lots of us do, and he's got that German, engineering type mind. When you say, let's just say we took 700 years out of the first millennium. So we would like, oh, okay, so it's like year 1300 something, right? And it's like, that's not really what he does, because he was saying he dates backwards. So he's basically saying like the times of Jesus would be like in the 800s, somewhere in that range, 800s, 900s. And so then you think about it, if the Romans were thriving at that time, because obviously that would have been the very beginning, the time of Jesus was like the very beginning of Roman rule, because that was the times of where, at least we're told, Caesar Augustus, like the first emperor. And obviously Julius Caesar was right before that. So just think about Rome really thriving in this period. And now we're talking about right around 1,000 years ago. Okay, so now think about the architecture that does look mud flooded. And obviously it's this Greco-Roman style. And you're like seeing like, oh my gosh, I can believe, I had a hard time believing that the buildings in our local cities could be 2,000 years old plus. But 1,000 years old, now I'm like, you know what? I think that they could be. So yeah, I'm of the belief now. And I know we were saying there's a guy who has a channel called The Mud Flood Was Armageddon. And I'm thinking like, he might be right. I mean, Yeah, maybe I could buy that now at least, and because we don't even get into the second millennium, where if if the history is this murky and there could be this many gaps in the first century, well, how many gaps could be in the second century or the second millennium? So then we could just be talking about we really don't have any clue how many years have been added to make the history work.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, we have our history pretty well understood for, let's say, the second millennium. So this is all about the first millennium, but we're pretty well documented. History kind of became a thing from like 1000 to 2000, shall we say, roughly. But like I said, if you just remove 700 years off that, it moves us back. And we're actually in like, what, let's say, is it 1350 or something right now, like, give or take, roughly, which means we can account for the last 250 years, which would have been at the end of 1070, which may have been like a reign of Christ in some, if you want to talk about, or something like, or 1,000 years where Satan was bound. And we can now play with this timeline, and people are saying to us all the time, it's like, well, if this is a little season, it's a very long little season. If the millennial kingdom started in 70 AD and ended in 1070, it's been like 1,000 years of Satan. You know what I mean? It's kind of, well, if we take this time out, it's not actually, it hasn't been that long anymore. Like this changes things again and puts us back into the realms of, it seems like this may have happened. Some things happened. And like I said, what are buried predominantly are the Greco-Roman style amphitheaters and basilicas. That's what we're digging up. Bathhouses, we're digging up pillars, we're digging up Roman arches that are round at the top rather than the Gothic arches, which are tall, which came afterwards. And he'll explain later, we'll get into it, but monasteries appeared after the 10th century, after the destruction, and a Christ-centric world just dominated immediately after this.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into that soon, which is kind of, again, hinting at a time where everyone got their eye on Jesus, and all they know is it's after Christ. That's all we know about time right now. It's going to get...
Yeah, well, you also think about it, like, so when you get into like the Matthew 24 prophecies, and you say there'll be tribulation that the world's never seen or never will see again. Whatever did this sounds kind of like what Jesus was describing, because this is like on a level I mean, like I said, it's unfathomable, like the destruction around the world.
Yeah, like I said, as he said, this didn't just centralize on Europe. All the way across to South America, the Mayan culture collapsed at the same time, as well as the Iranian, Middle Eastern cultures of Mesopotamia was collapsing at the same time. All the way up to China, they were having their own famine and destructions. Everywhere was having just an utter destruction event at this time. It's just we have more archaeological evidence for this area, and this is where he was obviously digging around himself as somebody who's into this. So this is why he's kind of Eurocentric with his view here, but this is not specific just to Europe. Not at all. He talks about the churches of Asia as well later, which we'll get into. And just to quickly summarize, just a shout out there to Mud Flood Was Armageddon. Alan Paco, I think his name is. He's a regular in the chat. He has been doing this for years. Way before we even got involved with this. He's one of the front-runner pioneers of... He was talking about these things on the internet when everyone was like, what are you on about? Shut up, you crazy madman over there in the corner. He was talking about this way before us, and now, obviously, our work is built on people, shoulders of giants like himself, let's say, who I don't know, broke through... He was like the vanguard, he was there trying to break through the naysayers' barriers in the beginning, and I think he's tired now. But he's still around, and go check out his channel if you haven't already. He's still in the game.
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna probably go more back into his channel now, because at first I did think, no, I don't think that could have been Armageddon, but now I'm like, yeah, that's actually my best guess right now. And I think, as you said, this will be more Eurocentric, because that's kind of like the history of the Romans in Europe, obviously, as where we live. I mean, that is kind of where most of the history would be important to us. But I think that the lack of history in other places too, like if somebody else across the world had this very linear story of history, then you could say, well, obviously this wasn't the whole world. But the fact that there's not good detailed history other places that goes past these times, well, I think it just confirms to me that it was the whole earth.
And just to make it clear, he was even saying then, like, dendrochronology, the tree rings. There's no consensus with the dating process there, even in the community who uses them as dating processes. It went through 3 different researchers, Mike Bailey and the Larsons and the such, and they were like, no, there's 1,000 years there in the tree rings in the 1st century. And then the author's like, no, I think there's only 550 years there. And someone else is like, no, there's only 300 years worth of tree ring. Like, and no one agrees with each other. But we have this idea in our heads, like, oh, well, they've figured it out. We have the evidence. We know the time the history is correct. It's like, well, even in that time period, people weren't documenting history as we understand it today. People weren't making chronologies. People weren't thinking like that in those times. That's what we do today. It's more nebulous than we think, and there is no true consensus on chronology as much as we like to assume there is, because we like to we trust people. We trust authority, Go ahead.
I got to be honest, and it's like I said, I've never claimed to be the smartest guy in the world. Do you understand what they mean by the dendrochronology? It's like, because I know that I get it. If I went down to my backyard and I chopped down a tree and I counted the tree rings, I could tell you how old the tree is. How do you tell me in 2024 how old the trees were during the first millennium anyways? Like, that seems like how do you go find wood beams in buildings and tell me when they were dated and based on the rings? Because wouldn't you have to know when it first sprouted, its first season?
It's not an exact science, like we're telling here. Like, no one's got any consensus even how to count the tree ring. So what? Every year a new ring appears. Is that fact? Are you sure about that? Are you certain that's how trees grow? Because everyone points to on the tree ring record, 536 always comes up. There's this one ring in old trees that is just absolutely tiny and withered, and the tree did no growing in that season. Like, basically,
there was a group of years where it did not grow well, and it was supposedly that's what I learned in that when I was researching that video, is that bigger rings represent a healthier. Obviously, the tree grew a lot in the one season, and so that represents a good, healthy year. And then if it didn't grow a lot, that represents terrible years. But as I said, I remember watching when I was commenting to Vitaly, I'm like, so how could you know this unless you chopped down a tree that you knew was 2,000 years old and then you counted the rings? Like, I don't know how you what I'm saying? Like, in my mind, I'm like, I get in theory that one ring represents a season, but don't you have to have a lot of other markers of like when this tree was planted, when it died, and all?
Exactly. And also, there are very few to wipe them all out at the same time, because there should be more. I've argued this before. There should be way more older trees on the Earth if the Earth is as old as we're told it is. There should be way more.
This also gives you a reason why there wouldn't be more old trees, because maybe the timeline is not as old as we think it is either. Like, we really don't. I mean, we only know, like, biblically, we know we can count generations and genealogies to Jesus, but after that, we really don't know. So if you think about, I would imagine the trees got wiped out in the days of Noah, if the flood destroyed almost everything. So then the trees had to start over again, and then they got wiped out again.
Yeah.
So how old would the trees really be? This actually gives a really good explanation of why there's not older trees.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's even then, the old trees they do claim are like thousands of years old. They're like World UNESCO heritage sites, and you're not allowed to go near them. And they're kind of like
it's really old.
They're blocked off as like a tourist attraction. It's kind of like no one's cutting down those tree rings and trying to find out what's going on there, And you look at them as well, and it's like, you can't call that a tree. It's a husk. It's a dead husk of a stump at best. It's kind of, that's dead. Yeah. That died a long time ago. That looks like it went through an incredibly horrible tribulation style event that destroyed it completely, and it's just barely still standing. It's kind of, where are the big, fresh trees still growing their leaves, still alive and well, branching out over the horizon, with these giants that we are told used to be in the ancient past. It's kind of, but that's the talk for another time. Let's carry on with the video. Let's do the next segment, shall we?
So, most of you will now think about Rome, and you think, but Rome has everything. At Rome, you find, for every century, from 100 to 900, you will find buildings. And this causes me to reenact, in a way, the first-class freshmen that study Christian archeological history. They are confronted with two enigmas, or with two miracles. Miracle number one: Christianity, they are told, is the only major religion in the history of man that had to do without temples, without buildings, without churches, for 300 years. enigma number one, miracle number one. Then, eventually, 300 years after Christ, in the 4th century, when they started to build churches, they decided to do this in the style that was 300 years out of date. So they built their churches in the basilica style of the 1st century. This is Old St. Peter, dated to the 4th century. And this is, in the same city of Rome, of course, the Basilica Ulpia, built in the late 1st century CE, or after Christ. This, of course, is downtown in Rome. It's a very rich building, and this is outside of the Roman walls, so it's a relatively poor building, but you can see, if you look closely enough, that it's more or less the same architecture. Okay, now we move to late antiquity, 4th to 6th century. And here we again find in Rome basilicas with these peculiar ground plans. And now you tell me, look, there you have it. You have this in antiquity in Rome, and you have this in late antiquity in Rome. Yes, that's how it is called. But these churches, they are never superimposed on buildings of antiquity. They are sitting in the same village, or the same big town, you have to say, in the same plane. They are not distributed like this, but they sit in the same archeological plane. Richard Krautheimer, the most ingenious scholar who ever put his mind to the problems of Rome, he survived the Holocaust in the United States. He was from Fürth in Germany, like Henry Kissinger. So what he discovered for himself was that in late antiquity, the Christians created a renaissance of antiquity, a perfect renaissance, down to the building materials, down to the roof tiles. And then in the early Middle Ages, 8th to 10th century, there was a second renaissance of the basilica types. And he was so precise that he could show in the 9th century, they imitated ground plans of the 5th century. And in the 8th century, they imitated ground plans of the 4th century. So, thus, it looks like a complete and perfect renaissance. But again, all three types of buildings are never found superimposed on each other. So that's why even for Rome, if you look at any particular area of Rome, you never find antiquity, late antiquity, and the early Middle Ages superimposed. You find them like this, side by side. And this is the question I'm just asking. Can we cut out 700 years out of the first millennium? I compare now Rome with Constantinople and Jerusalem. You see, this is antiquity Rome, 1st, 2nd century. This is late antiquity Constantinople, 4th to 5th century. And this again is Jerusalem, 1st to 2nd century. At the first glance, you get the impression this is the Circus Maximus of Rome with the imperial palace. This is Circus Maximus of Constantinople with the imperial palace. Down here, you get the impression, oh, they really try not to fall too much behind the 1st and 2nd century AD. So now we go into Rome, and you see in the colors, I gave the same colors to antiquity, late antiquity, and early Middle Ages. And in each period, you have the same basilica style, the same building materials, the same colors and paints. You have no new living quarters here and no new living quarters here. So the churches, they are divided over the three periods. But the same is not done with the living quarters. We have living quarters basically only for one period. Wherever you put them, you can put them here, you can put them here, you can put them here. But you don't have 3 times living quarters on top of each other. But what is even more striking in the latest period, 8th to 10th century, you have, as I mentioned before, the same Latin as 700 years earlier in the texts that are attributed to this period. Moreover, the texts that are attributed to this period mention nearly all the famous buildings dated to the 1st or 2nd century. From the Colosseum to the Pantheon, but everything appears to be intact again after the Western Roman Empire fell, after the Eastern Roman Empire fell. Suddenly, in the early Middle Ages, everything is intact again. So you have an additional hint that we are dealing for all the 3 periods with just one period that in chronology is distributed, split, put on top of each other, but that in stratigraphy and in cultural elements belongs to the same period.
Right, so there we go. He's basically explaining antiquity, middle antiquity, late antiquity, 700-year period. The buildings are the same, but he talks about the Christianity specifically, and he's saying there was no churches built by Christians in the first 300 years of their existence. Only until the 4th century, was it 300, around 300, something like that, maybe 400.
The times of Constantine.
Yeah. So
is what we're told.
That's what we're told. And that's never happened anywhere else in the history of any culture that's ever existed or any religion before. No, they've never gone that long without building temples or churches or anything at all. Just a place to gather, shall we say, rather than just anything else. A place, to call their own as a city that's dedicated to Christ or something like that. It took them 300 years to do that, and when they did decide to do it, they were building in the style that was 400 years out of date.
Yeah, the pagan style. Supposedly the pagan style.
Well, yeah, they were just building in a style that was well understood to work at the time, which was the Basilica style, so they were just copying the standard procedure to build a building in that time, in the early, in antiquity, in the 1st century style. But by, you'd think in 400 years they would have developed something new, some kind of new motif. But you can see the evidence there; they're the same. And historians have tried to equate it to the Christians did a Renaissance revival of 1st century architecture in the middle antiquity period, and then by the 10th century they revived it again, the 1st century style based off the 5th century style. It's kind of how many hoops do you have to jump through to try and justify why this is happening?
The Christians were trying to build an homage to the times they were being fed to lions,
exactly,
burned as Roman candles in the streets. They really were fond of that time, so they thought we'll build them just like Roman its prime.
Mm-hmm. Well,
it's obviously, I think that's one of the best points I said when we were watching that. That was one you and I first mentioned to each other, is that I've always thought, basically since we came to this conclusion that we're in the little season, I was like, there's something weird going on between the 1st century and jumping all the way to Constantine, that Christianity just explodes, where it goes from they're persecuting Christians in the 1st century, and then 300 years later, Rome becomes Christian.
Mm-hmm.
It does, there's something really off about that. And so what are the Christians doing in the middle? And it also answers questions about the questions we have about 70 AD. So what did the early Christians write about 70 AD? And there's really not a lot of writing about it. And it's what is going on right here? That there's not clear answers about what the 1st century meant to early Christians. And it's probably because it's stuff is stretched out, and then you have certain Christian martyr, Justin Martyr and all these other early church fathers, they're all spread out. And you're like, what if they weren't spread out? This actually makes a lot more sense. And actually, this video doesn't go into it, but I went to Gunnar Heinsohn's website, and he actually makes a case that Constantine is actually in the 1st century.
Am I correct that you move Emperor Constantine's reign to the 1st century?
Yes.
Why
Be-
why do you do that?
why do I do that? Because if you look, if you study stratigraphically, we have a wonderful research on the mausoleum of the nemesis of Constantine. This is Maxentius. That's the emperor.
Okay.
On the left side, you see the mausoleum of Maxentius, who was defeated by Constantine at the Milvian Bridge. That battle is dated 311 after Christ, 311 after Christ. Now, if you look at this mausoleum, you see the perimeter wall, the outer wall, and in this wall, you see cut into these walls smaller mausoleums, smaller tombs. And if you go to the bottom tomb, that is cut in the perimeter wall, that only 7 centimeters of this surrounding wall is left. So they cut this little mausoleum into the outer wall to stabilize it. And this mausoleum is dated before 550 after Christ. So the wall is dated 310 after Christ, but the mausoleum cut into the wall is dated before 50 after Christ. So that's a stratigraphic proof that this mausoleum must be from the first half of the 1st century after Christ. But we go back to Jerusalem, we have the same problem. Here we have a building by Maxentius, the enemy of Constantine. In Jerusalem, we have the Jesus mausoleum built by Constantine and his son and his sons around 330 to 360 after Christ in mainstream chronology. But these buildings, it's a wonderful basilica in the style of the 1st century in Rome, dated in the 4th century Jerusalem. And the ashlars, the very peculiar ashlars, have the style of the Herodian Hebrew Jewish kings' ashlars of the 1st century BC AD. This is not disputed. The ashlars in the 1st century are not disputed, and the stratum in the 1st century AD is neither disputed. Only the date, I give my date, which is around 40 to 60 AD. My date is disputed by the AD chronology because they say we cannot follow stratigraphy, we cannot follow the hard evidence, we have to follow the chronology. We do not understand, but we have it since nearly 1,000 years. And the chronology is all we have. I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but if I would interpret, so my colleagues say we have only one dogma. We are very good scholars, and they are, but the archaeology, the chronology is holy. Don't touch the chronology.
Right.
Wow. So like at that point, now we really are talking like that when the Romans converted to Christianity at a very early time, we are talking about like a massive move of God in a way that history doesn't really write about. We're just told that Constantine had some vision of a cross in the sky and he just conquer in the name of this. And he did. But when you put it in the 1st century, if he saw that vision in the sky, what if this was literally like Jesus coming on the clouds?
Mm-hmm. Well, people would say, well, how can that be? We have the evidence of the succession of Caesars throughout the Roman Empire up into Constantine, and that's spread out over a 400-year period, so that can't be the case. And someone left a really great comment. I can't remember his name now, so I'm sorry for this, but thank you for giving us this idea. But he says it seems like these aren't Caesars that successfully in succession, one after the other. These are like localized emperors of regions who are all existing at the same time, who were just in control, mini Caesars of different areas of the empire, not of the whole empire at one time, but they all had their own thing going on in different localized areas, and they weren't separated by time, and there may have been overlap between a few of them in the short period of time, but they weren't all the Caesar, the one ruler at any given time,
That's a good point too, when you really consider too that like just our U.S. dollar, and we have Benjamin Franklin's on the $100 bill.
Mm-hmm.
What year was he president? Oh, well, he wasn't president. So you could imagine like that sort of thing still happening in the Roman times, especially if America's modeled after Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, Elon Musk tweeted yesterday that America is the new Rome, and I just gave it like a emoji, like, ugh, like what are you talking about? But I mean, our coins. You go look at our quarter. You have the eagle on the back, and you have George Washington looking very much like a Caesar on that, and it's like, yeah, I can see them, and I think later we'll get into like why things are the way that they are. But he mentions, I think what it is like there's 1,000 years of history, or at least we're told the chronology says there's 1,000 years. I could see historians doing their best to stretch the history out. I mean, maybe not even like nefariously, just trying to stretch out history to make sense of it. Well, obviously, these Roman emperors would have rolled right around here. But again, if we're talking about 300 years and not 1,000, then yeah, it makes sense that Constantine would have been in this certain time period.
Well, as Carl Hoffey in the chat says, it's like governors of states in America. It's the same principle. Yeah. That's what they were actually referring to about many of these Caesars that supposedly ruled over a particular time. Maybe it wasn't, again, over this long period. And again, I don't know where we lay the church fathers into this as well, if you even want to consider calling another man father anyway, or the validity of all of that, if you want to get into that whole mess. But the people say, well, no, we have the apostolic succession all the way down to Peter, don't we, through the churches, and then the schisms that happened to the Eastern Orthodox and so forth, and we have the documented history. But what we're seeing here is, no, you don't have the documented history.
No, there's not documented history. Actually, I think even later, I'm not sure if it's this. I listened to a podcast he was on. He actually mentioned during the times of Marcus Aurelius, hey, like the Gladiator movies, there was this great fire in Rome that burned all their records up. So basically all the records of Rome were burned up at that time. So now we're in a place where very early on, you kind of get answers for why there's not history about this. Like questions that I've always had, answers to questions I've always wondered about, like, so how did the Roman technology get lost? It only makes sense in this kind of view. This is the only rational explanation to why did the Romans have so much kind of ancient technology that we don't know about? Why is Roman concrete better than the concrete today?
We don't know what they had.
Because literally there was like a reset on the level of, well, maybe not quite on the level of the days of Noah, but like a reset where people really have no idea. It's like they literally are just digging out cities and they don't have any idea how they were done.
I mean, we all learn about the Romans in like primary school and in high school, and they talk about the Roman like phalanx and the things they had, like the methods of war they developed, you know what I mean, which were advanced, and how they could just roll over everywhere wherever they went and just absolutely dominate everything. It's kind of like, well, maybe they had some kind of technology or weapon we were just not privy to now. There's no evidence for it anymore. People talk about, these giant cannons we find all over the place, like Conspiracy R Us shows these giant metal tubes that are all ornate and like gilded, and people say, oh, they're cannons. It's kind of like, there's no way that thing fired a metal ball anywhere. Look at the size of that thing. Who would lift the ball to put it in there? You know what I mean? It's kind of like, could they more likely have been frequency directed energy, vibration, resonator weapons or something like that? We're talking about the walls of Jericho coming down with a horn here, you know what I mean? We're talking about a level of like society that is difficult to comprehend. I mean, even these Roman cities are pretty incredible when you actually see them.
Yeah, they're very incredible.
Like,
they're very incredible.
How did they build those things again? We have to wonder. Like, I don't think we're dealing with primitive people at all. I don't think when Jesus was walking around in these societies of Rome, in Jerusalem or Roman occupied, I don't think they were as desert-dwelling, sandal-wearing like places. Wearing like ragged white, I don't know, what would you call it, papyrus cloth or something, you know what I mean? I don't think they were wearing those type of things. I think this was a much more advanced place than we understand, which also would explain why there's so many medieval paintings of Jesus wearing medieval clothing. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
right.
It's kind of all there, isn't it?
Now we are actually putting him in that
800.
Basically in that time period. It's not as crazy as it sounded. I remember when you first talked about that, I thought that's pretty wild, but no, it's like literally the end of the first millennia is like right in the times of like when you'd have like knights and all this kind of stuff. It's like all right there.
Mhm.
Even later he goes on toward the end of the video, and I know he mentioned on another thing, like we have these mythologies of King Arthur. He actually puts King Arthur in the times of what's his name? Julius Caesar.
Mhm.
So King Arthur would have been before Jesus.
Yeah, we'll get into that at the end. As a fact, I kept that in.
That's pretty
really good.
That's pretty interesting.
Let's keep powering forward. We'll get to that at the
Okay.
end. But that is a great point. Like, not only can we move Constantine back to the 1st century, we can actually move a lot of legends back, quite a lot, and there's good evidence for all of it. So let's carry on. I'll press play now, and we'll keep going with.
Come closer, my child.